All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 4. This week, we are moving on from our topics about the media, which realistically we could spend the whole 7 weeks talking about media and technology. There's a really great class from Justice Studies called Justice and Pop Culture, which would be a great thing for those of you who are really interested in that. But instead, we're going to move on and we're going to focus our discussions today on issues of law and policy and social change. And so, before I get started on our particular discussions about law, policy, and social change and the readings that you are required to do for this week, I want to take a minute to reflect on some of your comments from week 2 because I think that they're going to be very relevant to the ways in which we embark on our conversations about affirmative action, which is our case study for this week. And so, I want to be sure that we're all starting on the same page as we move forward, right? So one of the things that was brought up by a number of you in your discussion board post is this hesitance to talk about white privilege. And a lot of that is because of this defensive personal response in that we think that when we talk about white privilege, we're necessarily talking about racism and racist individuals. And I think that that's an important distinction that we need to make, right? When we're talking about white privilege, we're not necessarily talking about individual racism or racist individuals. Instead, we're talking about advantages that have been bestowed upon individuals who are either white-skinned or can pass as white or who can fit within this category of white. These kinds of advantages that they have been given. So that's this privilege that we're talking about. And so it's not to say that every white person is racist. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make because that's not what it is at all. And acknowledging white privilege is not acknowledging that you are racist. Instead, it's acknowledging that there are certain advantages that you are given because you are white that you did nothing to earn. I am white, as I've said, as you can see. I experience privilege from being white, and again, I didn't do anything to deserve this privilege or to earn this privilege. You know, we live in a meritocratic society. We talk a lot about merit, a lot about earning, about working hard. And so these are privileges and or disadvantages that are experienced that you did nothing to earn. And I think that that's a really important thing that we have to recognize. It's not about racism or being racist. Yes, there are racist white people. That's just, there are, as you saw in your videos and in your discussions, and as you see on the news on a regular basis. And so, but talking about white privilege is different than talking about racism and racists. And so it's an important thing that I want to make sure that you recognize. The second comment that I saw a number of people make is this notion that recognizing white privilege is somehow giving a pass to those individuals who experience disadvantage and saying that they don't need to work hard. And that's not at all what it's about. So when we're talking about acknowledging white privilege, or we're talking about acknowledging privilege at all, whether it be you are privileged because you are white, you are privileged because you are wealthy, you are privileged because you are beautiful. A couple of you talked about that there are other privileges that we have to recognize. It's not just about race. That's very true. Sex, so privileged because you are male, things like that. It's more than just that. So it's recognizing that you still should work hard. Everybody should work hard. Everybody should buck the system. Everyone should say, no, this is not enough for me. But we have to recognize that we don't all start at the same place. And so one of the videos, the very brief video that you'll watch this week, talks about that, and it illustrates that we don't all start in the same place, and it is foolish to think that we do. Individuals start in very different places, and that has to do with a variety of different identity categories that we fall into. It's not just about race, it's not just about sex, it's not just about class. You know, all of these identities compounded lead us to where we start. And so to say that we all start at the same place is to really neglect an entire history of structural and institutional disadvantage that has been in place. And it does a disservice to all of us. And so I think that it's important to recognize that. It is not a free pass to just not work hard and assume that somebody's going to give you something. It's not that at all. And it's not to say, oh, well, since I am disadvantaged, I'm never going to get there, because it's not that either. It's about recognizing, both for those people who fall within disadvantaged categories, but also particularly for those who fall within normative categories or those that have been advantaged, that to think that everyone is doing the same thing and starting in the same place and working just as hard is really unrealistic. So I want to commend you all for navigating really complex discussions in week 2, and we are just going to build on those. And so for those of you who are uncomfortable in week 2, I can pretty much guarantee that you will maintain discomfort here in week 4. So as I've said, we are moving into our discussion of law, policy, and social change. And so when we're thinking about issues of justice, we have to think about issues of law, policy, and social change, because a lot of the ways that we understand justice has to do with the ways in which we understand law and the ways in which we understand policy. And a lot of the ways in which we've tried to legislate justice come through these legislative and policy-oriented channels. And so it's important to think about that. It's timely, as it always is, as we are moving into this thing, particularly, so for example, today, President Trump is going to decide on the fate of DACA. And so all of these things are relevant in how we understand justice. We are also hoping that Congress will decide on how to handle budget and how to handle compensation for victims of Harvey. And so, these are issues of justice. They're also issues of policy and legislation. And so they're important to understand in tandem. So the first thing that I want you to read is Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. I'm sure that many of you have already read this. And so in the context that I want you to read it for this class, it's thinking about this idea of just versus unjust laws. And so here he is arguing, is it okay for us to break unjust laws? Is it morally right? Are we morally obligated to break unjust laws? So obviously, breaking of a law is illegal. So this isn't a legal discussion that we're having. Instead, it's more of a social justice, bigger global discussion of, should we break laws that are morally unjust? And so it's something to think through. Who gets to define what a just and versus an unjust law is? How do we understand this? And a lot of issues come into play when we're thinking about these. So think about that as you are moving through your letter from a Birmingham jail. The next thing that you're going to read is the introduction chapter to the book Access to Justice. And this is a really important idea, right? To think about access. So we like to think that everyone has access to justice, right? So as Deborah Rode argues, equal justice under the law is one of America's most profoundly and proudly claimed ideas, but it's also the most widely violated legal principle. And so thinking about who has access to justice, who should have court-appointed attorneys, how should we compensate those individuals? Should they be competent? Should they, be spending the same kind of time that private practice attorneys are spending? What is the role of pro bono work? All of these things fall in this notion of access to justice, and how do we have access to the legal system in particular, right? Because right now, as the American legal system is set up, it is weighted heavily on the wealthy side, right? So those who have financial means have more access to justice than those who do not. And so this is important when we're thinking about it, because we think about this idea of a court-appointed attorney. Well, that's only in a criminal case. It's not in a civil case. And most of us don't recognize that, and most of us don't understand sort of how the legal system works in terms of money. And so right now, being able to afford a private attorney gets you better justice than if you cannot afford that. And so is that fair? Is that something that should be the case? This is something that we have to work through, and we have to think about who should and shouldn't have access to justice, and how should they get access, and things of that nature. So she talks a lot about a variety of different issues within the legal system in terms of access. And so I want you to think about all of those. What is the role of law and legal assistance, and what is the role of access and the role of individuals? And so think about sort of the proponents to having better access to justice, as well as those who oppose, legal services that are predicated on thinking about the individuals who can't afford it. So that is access to justice, which is going to be something that is really important for us to think about throughout the rest of our sections. The next reading that you're going to do is Social Justice Law and Policy in Uncertain Times. And so this is the introduction to a book that was dedicated to the Justice Studies John Frank lectures. And so Dr. Provine and Dr. Zatz, both who are no longer at ASU, but who were founders of this program and who were former heads and department chairs. So what they're talking about is this idea that when we think about justice, it is one of those things that we all want. We all desire for justice, if not for ourselves, then for later generations. And so it's an important thing to think about, but it's also incredibly complex, and nothing about it is obvious. And so how do we think about it? Part of this is about how we understand the relationship between law and justice. And so this is important when we're talking about justice, because how do we understand laws and what the roles of laws and how they have been made and created? So we have to think about this, right? Because slavery was legal. So what role does law have to play in our notions about justice? And so thinking about those and thinking about, overarching state and thinking about the complexities therein. And then I am having your Feynman piece be optional. Yay! I'm sure you're very excited about that. I just realized that there was a lot of reading for this week, and I wanted to be sure that you had time to dedicate to your affirmative action readings. And so I have made that one optional. I still encourage you to read it. It's really a great piece, but I'm letting it be optional so that we can instead focus on our case study about affirmative action. Okay, so affirmative action is one of those debates within the public landscape that is very, very contentious. We all have very particular ideologies about it, and so it's important that as we traverse this, that we recognize that. Particularly for you as college students, it seems to be even more apparent and even more of a thing to talk about. And so I've given you some additional sort of background of it, but you have some readings that are focusing specifically on this notion of affirmative action. And so one of the readings that you'll do is White Identity and Affirmative Action, where Beverly Tatum, who you read her in week 2, where she's talking about, what was affirmative action? What was its purpose? Why do we have it? She addresses the notion of things like persistent residential segregation. She talks a lot about the fact that affirmative action is just that. It's encouraging and requiring and mandating those organizations, institutions, businesses that get federal funding to take affirmative action to ensure that their policies, their hiring policies, their admittance policies are not disadvantaging those groups that have already been historically disadvantaged from those sorts of institutions. One important thing to point out is that when we talk about affirmative action, we often are very critical of race, but those who receive the most benefit historically thus far have been white women. And so white women actually have benefited from affirmative action more than any other group. And so it's not just a race issue. We have to keep that in mind. Also, some of the things we need to think about in terms of affirmative action is its negative historical connotation with quotas. And so it's important to recognize that affirmative action is not a quota system. It is not saying, oh, you have to have this number of women or this number of non-white people in your institution. So that's something that we need to think about. It is about goals. It's about setting goals. It's not about using quota systems in order to adversely affect other people. So originally, affirmative action policies were just geared towards people of color as well as white women, but it has been more broadly opened to include persons with disabilities as well as Vietnam veterans. So Tatum does a nice job of giving you a really big overview of how college students in particular understand affirmative action and how they recognize it. She does a nice job of talking about the differences between a process-oriented affirmative action and a goal-oriented affirmative action. And so you'll want to know the distinction between the two of those. And also thinking about how do we think about affirmative action today? Is it working? Is it not working? What should we be doing? The next piece that you're going to read is a very in-depth, theoretically and legalese dense history of affirmative action by Nancy Stein. I know this one is a little bit harder to read. They didn't have a PDF version of this journal article. It was only in HTML, and so it's just sentence after sentence after sentence. It's not very aesthetic, and so it's kind of hard to read, but it's very, very rich historical overview of affirmative action and the legal policies and precedents that have been fought in order to talk about the policy. And so one particular example that she talks about, and one that I think will probably be relevant for you, is the Bake case, and thinking about this idea of reverse racism. And so a couple of you mentioned reverse racism in your white privilege posts, and so I think that this will be an important issue to discuss. I'm always hesitant to think about even the notion of reverse racism because it doesn't really make sense to me, right? Because it's racism. Wouldn't it still just be racism from another thing? Reverse racism, wouldn't that mean that racism then went away? But that's just my semantics thought on the matter. But often one of the main arguments against affirmative action is this idea that it is discriminating against white individuals, particularly white males, but white women as well. And so there's been a lot of discussion about it and this notion of preferential treatment for minority communities. And I think that this is one of the main personal ideological issues that people have with affirmative action, because many people have anecdotes. They have, a friend of a friend of a friend lost their job because they gave it to someone less qualified. And I think that it's something really important to keep in mind that 99% of the time that doesn't actually happen. So it's not allowing someone who's less qualified to have the job. And I think that that's what most people neglect. And so, for example, on the academic job market, often job ads will come out that will encourage applications from historically disadvantaged communities. And so it's seeking women, it's seeking people of color, it's seeking Vietnam veterans or people with disabilities. And the hiring committee themselves don't know any of that by the time they pick their pool of applicants. And so it's not as if they are just selecting, she's a woman, so I'm going to take her, even though her CV is not that great, or he's a black man, so I'm going to take him. It doesn't really work that way, right? So the committee goes through the applications, pick the people who are qualified, do their interviews, things like that. And it's often not until someone comes to campus that they actually know what the individual looks like. But there are things that sort of give away. So names, obviously, for women, they tend to be different than names of men. There are some gender neutral names, but often a name. So my name is Sarah. That kind of tends to be a female name. There's also racially coded names. And so people assume they know the identity of an individual either by their first name or their last name. So that kind of stuff can come into play. But on the whole, individuals who are on committees, hiring committees don't know who these individuals are. So it's not as if this preferential treatment is given up front. Instead, it's an encouragement to have people apply, to seek out, to put it into other networks. And so it's an interesting thing that we all think about, because we all often, people are automatic to jump to this, oh, well, it's going to someone who's less qualified, which isn't the case. And so I think that this is an important thing to think about. This is also reflects the Texas case of the individual who Cheryl Hopwood, who is talked about in your next article, and she talks about, she is suing the University of Texas law system because she felt that she was not admitted and that people who were less qualified were admitted. But a lot of what gets left out of that conversation is A, how do we know that somebody was less qualified for it? B, are there other things at play? It's an automatic assumption that the person is less qualified because they are a minority, and that's where the real problem lies, is because that's not often the case. And so this also builds into so the Nancy Stein article also builds into this conversation that we were having in week 2 about colorblindness. And so, are we advocating for a colorblind society? Oh, I don't see race. Or are we instead advocating for a diverse society where we have institutions and employment situations where there is diversity, and we are encouraging that and embracing that, and there is a color consciousness instead, or a gender consciousness, or an ability consciousness. So instead of thinking about it as being blind, oh, I don't see that you're in a wheelchair, I don't see that you're a woman, instead recognizing that, well, probably you do. Most of us do. We notice these things. And so recognizing that and embracing the variety and the diversity that it then brings. Okay, and the last one that you're going to read is reframing the affirmative action debate. And so thinking about the bigger issues, bigger conversations about democracy, about justice, about what is fundamentally fair. And so Lonnie Grunier is in this article is using the imagery of a miner's canary. And I think it's a really important thing to think about. It's about recognizing the structural dimensions at play, the bigger, broader environment in which these conversations are occurring. And so we need to think about those as we're progressing forward in our conversations about affirmative action. The intent of these policies are to make it so that hiring and educational institutions are not discriminating against those who have been historically discriminated against. And so it's an important thing to recognize. And it's so much bigger than what we tend to give it credit for. So it very much goes back to this understanding of privilege. And so we often talk about those who come from either impoverished communities or communities of color that don't do well on things like SATs or ACTs or other standardized tests, that somehow it is a personal failing on them. It's because they're poor, or it's because they are stupid, or it's because of a variety of different things, negating that often people who have financial means to get SAT and ACT prep tests, to have additional tutors and things like that, all play a role in how we then understand people's innate abilities or people's abilities to do well in school. And so it's so much more than just about who's getting admitted and who's not getting admitted. It's about how we understand those admissions criteria to begin with. And so these are all really hard conversations to have. They're emotionally charged. And so I know that this will be a tough week for many of you to get through and to work through your own ideas about affirmative action. And so I just, again, want to encourage you to be thoughtful in your responses. Think about how your identity is helping you understand these concepts, and think about how the purpose of reading all of these and watching these videos and things is to bring multiple parts of the conversation into one. So it's not just about the popular conversation or what you've likely learned growing up. It's about much more nuanced and complex decisions that have to be made. And then kind of building on your Deborah Rhodes chapter is the film that you need to watch for this week, which is a PBS Frontline documentary called The Plea. And so this is a really, it looks dated, so when you watch it, I'll just warn you now, it looks a little bit dated, but overall it is still very relevant, right? So when we think about access to justice, 95% of all criminal charges are pled out, and what are then the consequences of that? And what does our legal system that prioritizes plea agreements, what does that actually do for us? How costly is it? And what does that do for individuals who plead out to a lesser charge that may not be an accurate charge? It may not be something that they're actually guilty of. This is particularly important for people who don't have access to good attorneys, to competent attorneys, to attorneys who can expend the kind of resources on each client. Often public defenders cannot spend those kinds of resources or time, and so it's important to think about, how does that then play into our conversation about access to justice? Okay, I've said a lot. So that's it. As always, I am totally open to more dialogue about these things. I've thoroughly enjoyed the thought and effort you've been putting into your posts, and so I want you to keep up the great work. And let me know if you have any questions. All right, have a great day.